Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be giving you a guideline for hermeneutic analysis of Persian poetry. This guideline consolidates the principles, techniques and insights into a framework for hermeneutic analysis, guiding through each stage of interpretation, from fundamental principles to advanced applications, focusing on Persian mystical and philosophical poetry. However, the skills can be applied to poetry in any language. First of all, what is hermeneutics? Hermeneutics is the theory and methodology of interpretation, originally applied to interpretation of biblical texts, but later expanded to include texts of all kind, especially the philosophical and literary ones. At its core, hermeneutics seeks to understand the meaning behind the text, taking into account the context, language, and relationship between the author, the text, and the reader. Let's now start examining these principles, techniques, and insights. Now, let's examine the fundamental principles of hermeneutics. These are the questions you should keep in mind when you want to do such research, when you want to even understand the text. Like, forget about research, let's say I just want to read this poem to understand what's going on. Have these principles with you while you are going through the texts. Number one, textual depth. What do I mean by this? Acknowledge that Persian poetry operates on multiple levels. That is, literal, symbolic, philosophical, and mystical. Number two, hermeneutic circle. That is, move iteratively between understanding the parts, that is, individual verses or symbols, and the whole, that is, the poem, its themes. Number three, merge your interpretive horizons with the text's historical and cultural horizon to create new meanings. What do I mean by that? What is this horizon? It is a term in hermeneutics, in philosophy. We're not going to get into technicality, so a general explanation could be this. Fusion of horizons refers to the process of blending the reader's perspective, shaped by their experiences and knowledge, with the historical, cultural, and philosophical context of the text. So there is the reader on the one hand, and there is a text on the other. And this interaction creates a dynamic understanding, where new meanings emerge as the reader engages with the text's worldview. So you should understand that while you're approaching these texts, it's not a static reading, it's dynamic. It's not just the author and the text. You, as a reader, also add something to the text. Not to the point of distortion, but the way you interpret the text also depends on you, your culture, your background, your biases. It's a dynamic play. You are working together with the author, with the text to derive the meanings. It's not just the author and the book. So, next principle, contextualization. You should recognize the influence of historical, cultural, and philosophical contexts on the text's meaning. Sometimes we are reading something. Let's say we are reading Rumi's Masnavi. We cannot just approach the text trying to interpret it based on 2024. We should try to understand the context in which the author, in this case Rumi, wrote those verses. What shaped his view? Yes, it's a mystical book, but still, even in formulating them, even in discussing his views and the verses are influenced by history, culture, and philosophy. Like, there is this background in his mind that is impacting, that is influencing his verses. So we need to understand the context. What was the context from which and through which, historically, culturally, philosophically, that he wrote these verses? In order to understand the deep layers of meaning, we need to examine them. Fifth principle, multiplicity of meaning. You should embrace ambiguity and layered interpretations without seeking definitive answers. Someone looks at the poem and says, okay, Rumi is saying this, period, finished. As if that is the only meaning that could come out of the text. That is the only, truthful interpretation, disregarding everything else. This is a text that is written hundreds of years ago, and it is multi-layered. Yes, there are more competent interpretations, but still there are multiple interpretations, and there is this ambiguity. And this ambiguity is actually central to mysticism. Rumi could well explain these things, the ideas that he is having, through philosophy, very neatly, very systematically. Why did he not do that? Wouldn't it be easy for us, the readers, to read his thoughts, not in a scattered, chaotic way, but in a very neat, logically oriented premises and conclusions? Yes and no. It would be easier to understand, but that is not Rumi's project. Rumi is not trying to do philosophy in its rational, traditional, logical sense. This is a golden sentence. Rumi is not trying to convince you. He's trying to transform you. He's not trying to say, okay, it's premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, therefore conclusion. He's not doing that. He's saying, I want to transform your soul. So I want to engage your reason, and not only your reason, but I also want to tell you stories, narrations, historic and imaginary narrations, to engage your imagination, and more importantly, engage your emotions, so that you're in the game yourself, you're in those dialogues. And here is where the transformation occurs. It's not just reason. Just imagine this yourself. I come to you, I present something to you logically. Yes, it could be compelling, but we have seen this in our lives. When there is this element of emotion involved, we are even more biased to accept what is being said. So he's not manipulating your emotions in a negative sense. He's using those emotions not to convince you, again, to transform your soul. He's aiming for your soul, not for your ears. Now let's go to part 2, preparation for analysis. Main question, you should be asking yourself, what fundamental knowledge is required for analysis? And in order to answer this, you need to answer several sub-questions. What historical, cultural, and philosophical contexts shape the poet or the poem? What are the key concepts and symbols in Persian mystical poetry? So these are the things that you need to know as the background, as the context in which you analyze the poem you're analyzing. Again, let's go back to the case of Rumi. You're analyzing this poem from Divan-i Tabrizi. You cannot just interpret it in a void. You need to put it in the context of Rumi's general thought, in Sufism, and in the historic cultural era in which he appeared, to fully understand what he is saying. Sub-question number 3. How do Islamic mysticism, theology, or even Neoplatonism inform the text? There are lots of parallels, connections between several traditions. When you're studying Sufism, one of the important traditions is, of course, the tradition from which the text comes from, that is Islamic mysticism or Sufism. But there are also lots of theological themes involved in the poem. You need to have good grasp of them. You cannot just directly jump into the poem if you want to get into the depth of the meaning. And for those who are interested in philosophy, I would suggest going into Neoplatonism, because they very much so inform Sufism. As a scholar of Sufism, I understood Ibn Arabi better. I understood Rumi and Sheikh Mahmud Shabestari better through Plotinus's Annals. When you read Annals, it opens your eyes in directions that you wouldn't understand them from the poem directly, or from these mystical texts. So you need a background, you need a context in which you analyze the poem. What are the principles? Number 1, historical context. You should understand the poet's era, socio-political conditions, and intellectual influences. Number 2, cultural context. Study Persian poetic traditions, including the use of Ghazals, Masnavi, and symbolic language. Number 3, philosophical and mystical foundations. Familiarize yourself with concepts like Wahdat al-Wujud, that is the unity of being or oneness of being, Ishq in Farsi, that is love, and Fana, that is annihilation of the self, generally translated. I don't like this translation. It's misleading. It should be self-transcendence. In order for you to understand what is going on in a poem in Persian intellectual tradition, you need to understand these concepts. Why? I'm gonna recite a poem from Faiz Kashani. who was an Iranian 12th Imam, Shi'i Muslim philosopher, logician, poet, mystic, jurisprudent, muhaddith, and a chronic commentator during the Safavid period. That is, during the 17th century Persia. I'm gonna be reading you a Ghazal from Faiz Kashani's Divan, and we are going to use it as a sample to understand what is going on here. He starts the poem by saying, دل از من بردی ای دلبر به فن آهسته آهسته تهی کردی مرا از خویشتن آهسته آهسته کشی جان را به نزد خود ز تابی کفکنی در دل به سان آنکه می تابد رسن آهسته آهسته. With gentle art and charm you claimed my heart gradually, gradually, and hollowed me out of myself gradually, gradually. You draw the soul to yourself, kindling a flame within the heart, much akin to a rope being pulled gradually, gradually. Later in the poem, this line appears. ز بس بستم خیال تو گشتم پای تا سر من تو آمد خورده خورده رفت من آهسته آهسته. So deep my contemplation, I became you from head to toe. You came little by little, and I left gradually, gradually. Well, reading this text literally, well, you will gain some understanding. But if you want to understand this poem deeply, you need some intellectual background that gives you a depth, that gives you a deeper layer of meaning. You'll understand that, okay, he is talking about Wahdat al-Wujud, about uniting with the Divine Beloved. So together with your poetry readings, you should also be reading the text from the tradition to understand important concepts. But then, if you're familiar with Mullah Sadra's version of Wahdat al-Wujud, we call it Sadrian transcendental philosophy, Sadrian gradational unity of existence. You will understand that this is quite a peculiar text. This is presenting a gradational ontology. In this Ghazal, Faiz Kashani uses the phrases gradually, gradually, aheste aheste, or khorde khorde, little by little, to mirror the gradationist ontology indicative of Sadrian philosophy. In the poem, he narrates a progression of self-emptying, gradually, gradually, liberation from personal existence, gradually, gradually, and severing the life thread from the body, gradually, gradually. This philosophy is most vividly illustrated in the last line I recited. I contemplated you so much that I became you from head to toe. You came little by little, and I left gradually, gradually, which is a vivid portrayal of transformation and transcendence. The poem pictures like the transition from the material to the spiritual world, self-transcendence and unity with the divine, reflecting the vertical gradation of existence, an upward journey on the ladder of existence. Picture Faiz Kashani is painting here reflects his philosophical loyalty to his master, to Mullah Sadra. As you can see, this added a new depth to the meaning of the text. So, going back to the same conclusion, while you're reading the poems, it's also very beneficial to understand the tradition. Now, the fourth element here was linguistic nuances. Pay attention to Persian language's flexibility in conveying layered meanings. You shouldn't be too rigid, too strict with the text. I have this interpretation, and that is the best interpretation in the world, and that is the only true one. All else is wrong. If you really go with this mentality, you haven't understood this tradition at all. Part 3 includes identifying key themes and symbols. The main question is, what are the central themes and symbols in the text? And to understand that, you need to ask these 3 sub-questions. What themes are most prominent, like love, separation, unity? And what symbols recur, and what do they signify? Usually in Persian mystical poetry, there is the symbol of wine, the beloved, and iconically in Rumi there is the symbol of reed, singing of separation. What are those symbols and what do they signify? Next question is, how do these themes and symbols interact within the poem? So what are the principles? Number 1, symbolic language. Decode recurring symbols considering their mystical, philosophical, and cultural connotations. For example, in Rumi's famous poem "Beshno az ney chon hekayet mikonad, az judayi ha shikayet mikonad." Listen to the reed as it complains of separation, a genetic translation. In Rumi's thought, in the tradition as a whole, to understand what's going on, and following this, the symbol of reed in Rumi's worldview is the human soul, or to put it more technically, it's the ma'ana or ma'ani, that is the meaning of humanity. To put it in Ibn Arabian terms, it is the ayn thabita, the fixed entity or the quiddity of the human being, the whatness of a human being in the world of God's knowledge. Once in the presence of divine beauty, once in union with God, the human soul realizing that there is this separation from the divine beloved, from the fatherland, that the soul doesn't belong to this material limited world. The soul suffers, and as a result of the suffering, it starts singing and lamenting like a reed. That is why Rumi is using reed as the symbol here. Here we decoded in a level the symbol of reed, which gives us a much clearer and deeper understanding of the verses and allows us to appreciate the poem more. Number 2, thematic clusters. Group-related themes to understand their interplay. Number 2 is thematic clusters. Group-related themes to understand their interplay. Like, what are the steps? I want to analyze several poems or several parts of a poem. I break them. They do not always appear in chronological order or thematic. I need to rearrange them, group them into certain themes to see what's going on. And when I do so, I understand, okay, there was first separation from the divine beloved. And this, for example, leads to longing as a burning fire, making you lament like a reed. And as a result of this, you start your mystical journey to go back to the divine beloved. You go through some stages in this journey, and finally you arrive at the unity with the beloved. This grouping is going to help you enormously. While you're interpreting the symbols, my recommendation is do not rely on just one poem. There are engines now allowing you to spot the instances of a certain word in, for example, Rumi's poetry. You need to go through every single one of them. Let's say we are going through the word reed. You need to find all the instances in which Rumi has talked about reed, study those lines and the poems containing those lines, and put them in thematic groups to see what comes out of that analysis. That is a key step in doing such research. Otherwise, you're going to be having a very limited perspective, and you're not going to be able to connect the dots to see the big picture. Number 3, dynamic symbolism. You need to explore how symbols transform or take on new meanings across different contexts within the poem. The reed appears in the initial verses of Masnavi. Does it appear in other poems and in different contexts? And does it still mean the same thing, or different usages have different meanings in different contexts? You need to understand this. Part 4, Contextual Interpretation. Main question is, how does the text reflect its historical and cultural context? To understand this, you need to answer these 3 sub-questions. How does the poem's historical moment shape the themes and symbols? I already explained this previously. You need to understand the history. These poets and their poems do not just appear in a vacuum. For example, there are people who came before Rumi. They had poetry. There are people, mystics, philosophers before Rumi. They had talked about similar topics. So what did they say, and what did Rumi add to that, and how did he do that? You need to understand the historical aspects. Number 2, what philosophical or mystical traditions influenced the poet? I gave you the example of Faiz Kashani. In that poem that I recited, there is this philosophical tradition that has influenced Faiz Kashani, that is the Sadrian transcendental theosophy. If you don't understand that, you're not going to be understanding the poem properly. Number 3, how do Islamic and Sufi theological concepts inform the text? You're enjoying its beauty only to realize that that's actually a paraphrase of a Quranic verse, or the paraphrase of a prophetic narrative. And locating that narrative, locating that verse is going to put things in perspective. So what are the principles? Intertextuality. Identify references to earlier texts such as the Quran, the Hadiths, or other Persian poets. Where does the chronic verse appear? What is surrounding it? What is the context for that verse? That is going to bring into light some valuable information when trying to decode the poetic verse. How about other Persian poets? For example, Rumi has this famous line, "Haft shahr ishq ra attar gasht o ma hanuz andar khame yek kuche eim." Attar journeyed through the 7 cities of love, yet we are still in the corner of an alley. If you do not know Attar, you will not understand what Rumi is saying by the 7 cities of love. Studying Attar's works make you realize that the 7 cities of love actually represent the 7 stages in the mystical journey. What are their details? How do they help us interpret the text? Number 2, cultural embeddedness. Consider how the text reflects or criticizes norms of its cultural and religious environment. For example, Hafez is quite famous for criticizing the rigid understanding and the superficial understanding of the religion of his era. He is always criticizing the Zahid, that is the pious, but not the pious in a generic positive sense, but in the sense of a person who either denies or ignores completely the inner aspects of the religion, focusing only on appearance, and then going around and accusing the mystics of blasphemy. How does a poem criticize that? Well, its master is Hafez Shirazi. When you read it, he's using symbols, he's using metaphors heavily, so that he creates a dual aspect of criticizing the rigid understanding of religion of his time and still allowing himself some breathing space not to be cut. Instead of directly criticizing, say, a king, one could write symbols and allegories through metaphoric language, criticize the same king indirectly. Number 3, philosophical lineage. You should trace the connections between the poem's ideas and broader intellectual traditions, such as Sufism or Neoplatonism. Again, we discussed this before. To understand the depth of Sufi poetry, you need to have a great understanding of, for example, Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being. Section 5, structural analysis. The main question you should be asking is, how is the poem's structure integral to its meaning? How do you find that? Well, you need to answer these 3 questions. What is the poem's overall structure? Is it linear or is it cyclical? Does it move step by step in a linear way? Number 2, how do individual parts, that is, verses, couplets, contribute to the whole, to the entire poem? How does rhyme, meter, or rhythm enhance meaning? So what are the principles? Number 1, macro-analysis. You should examine the poem's overarching structure and progression of ideas. What is the theme in the entire poem? What is the big picture? How does this fit into Rumi's general ideas? Step back a little bit and look at the poem from a distance. Number 2, microanalysis. You should analyze individual verses, focusing on how they build or contrast with the main theme. You read this poem and you realize that all the steps, all verses are in one direction, and then comes this verse that is a paradox. It goes in the opposite direction. So what is happening? Well, number 3, poetic devices. Consider how literary techniques like repetition, paradox, or juxtaposition create meaning. Rumi speaks through the poem. At the end of the poem, immediately says, okay, stop, silence. Do not disclose the rest anymore. So what happened there? Why silence? Why you're speaking, why do you go silent at one point? He takes us with him, step by step, up to the edge, and at that edge, he leaves us. Why does he do that? We need to think about this. We need to understand why he's doing this. If you were to go silent, if you were to not talk about it, why bring the readers to that point? If you didn't want to disclose it, why tell the reader about every step? Coming to that border and say, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. If you wanted to not talk about it, why did you mention it? See, there is something happening here and you need to understand that. Part 7, layered interpretation. The main question you should be asking is, what meanings emerge from different interpretive levels? And to understand that, you need to answer these 3 questions. What is the literal meaning of the text? You read the words and they speak to you on appearance. You look at the verses and you try to understand on an apparent level. It conveys some knowledge, but it's limited, it's superficial. So what do we do next? Here comes the second question. What allegorical or symbolic meanings can be derived? And the next one, what deeper philosophical or mystical truths are implied? So what are the principles? Literal level. Start with the straightforward meaning of the words. That's going to give you a limited picture. So then delve into number 2, symbolic level. Explore the metaphors and imagery in the cultural and mystical context, not just in that poem. Study it in the poem, go beyond, see what is happening in the tradition. Number 3, philosophical level. Unpack abstract ideas and their implications for human existence or divine. Rumi says, I'm suffering from this distance. I'm lamenting because of the separation from the divine beloved. Fine, what implications does this have for the human existence? We are separated from the divine beloved. How is it going to influence our values? Are the things that were valuable to us before still valuable after coming to this conclusion? How does our lives lose meaning? And what meaning does our lives find through this realization? So you should go back and forth with the text, talk to the text, argue what is happening, and then talk to yourself, have this self-dialogue. What do I get from this in my life? These are not just theoretical things, the poets throwing words on paper. They are there for a purpose, to transform. Fine, I read this, I realized this. How does this help me in my life? That's why Rumi brings you to that edge. He speaks, he brings you to a point after which he leaves you so that you have that self-dialogue with yourself. Number 4, mystical level. Reflect on how the text conveys ineffable spiritual truths. When Rumi wants to talk about divine manifestations, at times he uses the word face. So I saw the divine face. He says, well, he's talking about the divine manifestation he has received in his heart. How do we get from the face to the deeper meaning? Not just a symbol, but also mystical levels of such interpretation. This again goes back to your readings of the tradition as well. You cannot just take a look at Rumi's text for the first time in your life, trying and understand everything that is going on there. Now, an important part is handling ambiguity. The main question you should be asking yourself is, how should I approach ambiguous or contradictory elements? And to answer this, you need to answer these 3 questions. What are the possible interpretations of ambiguous lines and symbols? How do contradictions enhance or complicate the poem's meaning? How does ambiguity reflect the poet's mystical worldview? What are the principles? You should treat ambiguity as strength inviting multiple interpretation, not as a weakness necessarily in the poem. It's not that the text is always self-contradictory or puzzled as if the author cannot put his or her thoughts together. Sometimes, especially in mystical texts, we are deliberately using ambiguity. We are deliberately using contradictions and paradoxes because there is the element of coincidence of opposites in the higher realms. And you cannot talk about them, categorize them, classify them in a straightforward philosophical way. You cannot put them into logical steps. Ambiguity, paradoxes are parts of mystical epistemology and vocabulary. Number 2, tensions and paradoxes explores how contradictions reflect mystical truths. Step number 3, reader's role. You should acknowledge how your perspective influences the resolution of ambiguity. The next part concerns integration of reader and text. The main question you should be asking is, how does my perspective influence the interpretation? What preconceptions or biases do I bring? And to answer this main question, you should answer the following. What preconceptions or biases do I bring to the text? Rumi hailed from a certain school of thought in Islam. As a Christian reader or as a Muslim reader from another school of thought within Islam, I have some biases. When I'm interpreting the text, will I allow myself to bring those preconceptions and biases into my interpretation, or will I have the courage and strength to analyze the text objectively? Number 2, how does engaging with the text challenge or expand my understanding? Have I trapped myself in my own school of thought Or to put it more exactly, am I trapped in my interpretation, my limited understanding of my school of thought or my religion? Or am I open to open my horizons and realize that my understanding of my religion or from my sect does not necessarily and always mean that religion or sect? I might have a limited or distorted, a wrong understanding. So am I open to challenge myself to expand my horizons? 3. What new meanings emerge from the interaction between the reader and the text? Let us take a look at the principles. Let's start with reflexivity. Be mindful of your own interpretive lens and its impact on the analysis. You look at Rumi's poems and the word wine, sharab in Farsi, is everywhere. Are you going to take that literally? Or are you going to allow yourself to ask whether Rumi bothered himself with several thousand lines of poetry to talk about wine? What is that mystic love that he's speaking of and he's lamenting so much when it comes to Shams Tabrizi? What is the nature of that love? Is it merely physical, or do you allow yourself to question whether there was something more, whether there is a love beyond the physical? What is the nature of this spiritual love? Number 2, dialogue with the text. You should treat interpretation as an ongoing conversation between the reader and the text. I told you before, talk to the text. Don't just be a passive reader. Speak to it. Like, what are you telling me here? How about the verse from Ghazal such and such? They seem to be contradictory. What is lying beneath this line? And number 3, fusion of horizons. Strive to merge your modern perspective with the text's historical and cultural context. Something happened centuries ago and Rumi is trying to convey that. At our time, do we have the same perspective and the same understanding, the same depth and angles when we analyze the same matter? It is crucial that we not look at the text from our contemporary perspective. I mean, when we are trying to understand what Rumi is saying, we read him as if he's living in 2024. We need to understand him, put his words into the context of his time, into the context of his culture. And I have complained so much in my papers about this matter. These days there is this great attempt to put Rumi's works into the context of Western texts. These days there is this unbelievable emphasis on contextualizing Rumi's thoughts in Western thought alone. You read a book or an article and the author goes on and on talking about Nicholson and Arbery and other Western writers. And I do agree they bring value and insight into the matter, but that alone is not enough. How about the context within the Sufi tradition, the Persian Sufi tradition from which Rumi hailed? How about contextualizing it through the words of Attar? Or when we are examining the matter in contemporary context, how about analyzing Rumi's poems through commentators like Karim Zamani, like Shafi'i Katkani, who are great writers and commentators on Rumi's thought from within the Iranian tradition. They live in the tradition, they study the tradition, they write from within the tradition. Why not examine those? Many people haven't about heard their names. Part 10, Synthesis of Insights. The main question is, what overarching conclusions can be drawn from the analysis? Important sub-questions. How do the themes, symbols, and structure contribute to the text's overall meaning? What does the analysis reveal about the Persian mystical or philosophical thought? How does this text contribute to the broader discussions in literature, philosophy, or mysticism? We delve so deep into the century in which the author was writing, we forget to come back to our time. Fine, we talked about all this, but how does that fit our current dialogue in the literature? And this is still a big issue. We need to bring those discussions, those perspectives, insight into a contemporary dialogue. How do they align or differ from the positions, from the theories, angles that we have in the contemporary academic circles? So what are the principles? Holistic understanding. You should integrate insights from all levels of interpretation to form a comprehensive understanding. Number 2, identify how different elements like symbols, themes, structures converge to convey the poet's message. You should put together different themes, symbols, structures, different interpretations, opposing given interpretations, next to each other to see what's going on, what the big picture is. Number 3, broader implications. Reflect on the text's significance for contemporary readers or scholars. Some works analyze Persian poetry in a very abstract way. There could be some abstract symbolic understanding of these texts. We should study those abstract ideas, the symbols, and what is going on in the text, and bringing them back to our lives in the contemporary time. We go on and on talking about the primacy of existence or quiddity. Other than academic circles, how on earth is it going to help the contemporary reader beyond academia? We, as the writers, should be connecting the dots. We should be explaining how these points inform us in our lives today. You shouldn't leave everything to the reader. I hope this video helped you and will help you in your studies, shedding light on both the apparent and deeper meanings embedded within Persian poetry. Thank you very much for watching. Please do not forget liking the video to help the channel, and consider sharing the video with friends who would be interested.